Now, to begin, the way we'll structure this is that we'll begin with Johan Hallenberg from the Swedish Foreign Ministry giving some overview of developments outside in the IGF and the Human Rights Council, and then he will do so for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll move to ask from input from some of our participants, from our colleague, the Finnish parliamentarian, from the private sector, from ISOC and others. And then we will open up discussion to where to from here, and we hope to take that as an input into the main session, which is currently underway. I'm sorry, okay, you're losing me again. The volume is going down. So hands up those who can hear me. Those who can hear? So, it's very strange. Very, okay. Johan, can you test your mic and see if people can hear you?
Is it better? This one is better. Okay. Alright, okay. Alright, great, thank you. I got the power. Excellent. So good morning everyone, and thanks to APC for arranging this. This was an idea that came up during the preparations for the IGF, and we were very happy to jump on APC's proposal to arrange this first, I think, roundtable on human rights. And I have volunteered to speak a little bit about our work in the UN, the Human Rights Council, trying to push the agenda for enjoyment of human rights online. This is one of several initiatives that we're working with, but during this roundtable I will focus on the work we've been doing in the Human Rights Council. Can everyone hear me, either sort of offline or online? Yeah, is it okay? The initiative to address this issue through the Human Rights Council came up a few years ago when we realized that freedom of expression had been dealt with by the Council for a long time. There has been a special rapporteur appointed by the Council since 1993 by the then Commission on Human Rights, and there have been many consecutive resolutions on freedom of expression. Some of them have included also references to ICTs, but there have never been work particularly focusing on human rights enjoyment on the internet. We've seen the Special Rapporteur, as you know, he has produced several reports to the UN system on freedom of expression on the internet and how it does apply and what the practical consequences and interpretations ideally should be. He presented one report to the Council in 2011 in June, and another one to the General Assembly the same year in the fall. We thought, therefore, that it would be appropriate for the Council and the Council members, the state members, there are 47 state members in the Council, to address this issue also in the Council. At first we made contact with like-minded countries on a possible way forward. We wanted to create a group of like-minded, a group of friends for this issue, and also sound out how we ideally could move ahead. The advice that we were given was to move very slowly and to move with a step-by-step approach, and not to move too quickly, but rather to address this issue in a step-by-step approach. So the first action we did was actually a cross-regional statement in support of Frank LaRue's report in June 2011. The year before, we had also done a similar statement, but very short and not really focusing that much on it. We were supported by 9 states at that time. But in follow-up to Frank's report, we received support from 40 states around the world. We were quite cautious of getting a cross-regional support for this statement in order to show that this is an issue which is not only pushed by governments in the Western Hemisphere or in the Northern Hemisphere, but actually an issue which concerns countries from around the world. We had our intention was to get support from 5 countries from each region. That would give us 25 countries, but momentum built, and we quite easily got support from 40 countries. This statement supported many of the conclusions that the Special Rapporteur had brought up in his report, and thereby in effect welcoming the report and also affirming and confirming the conclusions therein. This statement was read out during the 17th session of the Council, and in the same year, in the fall, we took the initiative of asking the Council to arrange an expert panel discussion on this topic. Now, this is a formal decision that the Council takes, and that decision was adopted during the 18th session in September, so that's exactly 1 year ago. This expert panel was then arranged in February this year, on the 29th of February, with the attendance of High Commissioner Navi Pillay, Special Rapporteur Frank LaRue, Foreign Minister Carl Bildt, and a multi-stakeholder representation from various stakeholder groups, including academia, industry, and civil society. This expert panel was it was the first time ever that this topic was on the agenda of the Council, and the interest among the states in the Council of participating, asking questions, commenting on this topic was enormous. People working with the High Commissioner's office, they told us they had never seen that kind of activity during an expert panel before. There were so many states and governments that wanted to comment, we simply ran out of time. There was no possibility to cater to all the questions that came. Most of the countries that commented did so from a perspective of freedom of expression also applies online. However, some countries' interpretation of the limitations to this right were quite extensive, and I think that was the main takeaway from that discussion in the Council. It was also very clear that many states saw the link to development, that access to internet was a key factor to development in their countries, and that was another thing that came out. After the expert panel, we sort of tried to understand how to move ahead, and with the consultations with a like-minded group of countries, we presented a short resolution to the Council during the 20th session in June this year. The core group of countries in which these discussions were held included, besides Sweden, also Nigeria, Tunisia, Turkey, Brazil, and the United States. So there were 6 countries in this core group, and reflecting various regions of the world. Again, we were quite careful and quite conscious of the fact that we wanted to have a broad participation from the various regions of the world. If I speak like this, is this okay? Can everyone hear me? Is that okay?
Like this.
I'm trying to do exactly as I'm being told. The discussions in the core group were quite clear. The mandate that we took upon ourselves was to create a short but very concise resolution, trying to affirm a few very basic principles. We ended up with a short text that included two things. The first one is the confirmation or affirmation that human rights apply online as well as offline. So the same human rights that we have in the offline world, they also apply in the online environment. Now this may sound as something self-evident, but this fact has never been confirmed by the Council before, only by expert groups. The other thing, and in particular we highlighted the right to freedom of expression in Article 19. The other thing the resolution deals with is the matter of access. And the resolution urges all states to work to the effect to improve access to the internet as a driver for development. So that was the second part of the resolution. I think by making the resolution quite short and focused, it was quite difficult for many countries not to accept it. We immediately got quite a lot of support from a number of countries around the world, and also countries that normally would have difficulties with acknowledging freedom of expression in its entirety on the internet, also accepted this resolution. The number of co-sponsors stopped at 87. So 87 countries was co-sponsoring this resolution with us, which is actually a very high number. During the adoption in the session in the Council, we were not sure if any country would bring the resolution to a vote. We were not sure if we had managed to convince the most reluctant states that this resolution was necessary and ideally adopted by consensus. So we were not sure. There were two states that made interventions during the negotiations in the Council. It was Cuba and it was China. Both these countries mentioned that they had been part of the negotiations, that they had proposals to the text which had not been accepted, that they had got some proposals that were accepted, but they still would like to see amendments to the text.
Yes.
However, in the spirit of collaboration and cooperation, both of these countries decided to join consensus on this resolution. These two statements were actually quite similar. So the resolution was adopted by consensus of the Council. Now this is, of course, to us this is an important thing. That the resolution was adopted by consensus means that there is in effect a universal backing of these principles, which makes it, of course, easier for us and for like-minded and for civil society and others to argue that there is actually some kind of agreement universally around these principles, that they also apply, that human rights also apply online. In this moment in time, we are considering how to move ahead, how to follow up on this resolution, and during the IGF, I've been talking about this resolution in a number of workshops, trying to get some input on people's ideas on what they would like to see us do next in the Council. We're in a period of time where we have to reflect on the best way forward, but this is where we are at this point in time. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. If you can hear me, Joachim, I was going to call on you, well, Joachim de Groot, next, and possibly suggest using the stage microphone, in case that I don't know if the quality will be any better, but if you are willing, and then I will call on my colleague from Finland. Yeah, we'll go. Yeah.
talk on your...
Is that or better? No? Better, yeah? Good. Well, thanks, George, for giving me an opportunity to speak this morning. My name is Johan de Koper, of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I always say that I am the Dutch Johan, in the sense that we've both been working on internet freedom issues for quite some time now. Johan told you about the efforts of Sweden in the United Nations, which have been instrumental and extremely important, I think, in pushing this agenda forward. I will tell you a little bit about our Dutch policy, which has developed, I would say, since 2009, focusing specifically on internet freedom as a separate type of policy priority, which was kicked off, I would say, by the elections in Iran, but also by the events in Moldova already in April 2009, which is what most people always forget, but actually that was the first time that Twitter was really used for organizing protests, and that kicked off, I would say, international attention for the media, for that medium. We've had a broad approach to internet freedom ever since. There's a few things we focus on. I would say that you could divide it into three different categories. The first would be work in multilateral fora, whereby, as we just heard, Sweden takes the lead within the UN. We've been trying to also be a leader on internet freedom in a few other fora, the European Union. We've lobbied already since 2010 for export control on technology that can be abused for human rights abuse, which is not very easy. It's quite difficult to get a common European position on this. We were very happy that the sanctions on Iran and Syria passed last year, as Marietje Schaake described yesterday, but we feel, as she also has proposed, that it's important also to make sure that other countries cannot get their hands on technology if there's good reason for us to believe that they will abuse it. So that's something that we keep working on, trying to reach out to other European Union member countries, and we hope that the push by the European Parliament that came through last week, again, adopting for a broader approach, will also be met by the countries and the European Council. The other fora that are important for us in this regard are the OSCE and the Council of Europe. In the OSCE, there is a lot of discussion, especially about the safety of journalists online, where we feel it's important to get standards to broaden the protection of journalists, also those working online. This is an important issue ahead of the Dublin ministerial meeting of the OSCE, which is taking place at the beginning of December. And we hope to be able to get a strong statement out acknowledging this, which doesn't prove to be very easy. I would say that of the OSCE members, there are currently 13 or 14 countries that are not so much willing to focus on the protection of journalists online, and we're trying to get to common ground, but it's not as easy as we would want to see it. Another organization, as said, is the Council of Europe. It also do a lot of important work in this regard. We've not had the capacity to be as active in that as we would have wanted to, but I think we're going to try and up that over the next few years. What we, as a Dutch government, spend most of our time and capacity on is the Freedom Online Coalition. The idea for this coalition came up somewhere in 2011 when we'd been working very closely and effectively together with partners like Sweden, the United States, the United Kingdom, and some other countries, but we also felt it was important to get together and to see what we were doing in close cooperation with other stakeholders and to bundle our efforts a bit better. And that's why we organized a Freedom Online Coalition, Freedom Online meeting conference in The Hague in December 2011. It gathered about 200 to 250 bloggers, cyber dissidents, companies, international organizations, representatives of governments, and others to The Hague. The keynote speaker was Hillary Clinton, who give a very long and inspiring speech on internet freedom, particularly focused on the role of companies in this regard. But we also had the executive chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt, attend, as well as a total of 8 ministers of foreign affairs or ICT. And what was especially important for us is to make sure that this was a global meeting. We wanted to make sure that if we build a coalition, it's truly global, because we're facing global issues that require a global effort, which is why we were very happy that already at this first meeting there were about, I think, 22 countries represented, of which 15 formed the Freedom Online Coalition at the end of that first meeting in December. The goals of the coalition are described in a founding document, whereby I would say there are 4 important pillars. The first is that as a coalition we embrace the multi-stakeholder model and take that as a point of departure in all our discussions, trying to be inclusive as possible. The second is that we together try to focus our efforts on being as concrete as possible in supporting people in need, individual bloggers and cyber dissidents, but also other people working in this field. And this has become concrete by the establishment by some members of the coalition of the Digital Defenders Partnership. Digital Defenders Partnership is a fund which currently holds a little over 2.5 million euros and is administered by HIVOS, the civil society organization in the Netherlands, which is targeted at supporting projects that are focused on rapid response mechanisms to help people that are in need in dire situations. This will be active as of January 1st, 2013. There are some people of HIVOS walking around here, and they have all the details as they administer it. So I would encourage you, in the little time we have left, to talk to them about it if you can. You can also always contact me and reach out to the Dutch government to hear more about it, and to also learn about what possibilities there will be in regards to this fund. Am I going over my time? Yeah. Okay. I just want to conclude a little bit about the Freedom Online Coalition. 2 other focuses is on that we engage more closely with companies on their responsibility for internet freedom, and I think I forgot the last pillar right now. I just wanted to refer to the Kenya meeting that was held in September of this year, which was the 2nd Freedom Online Conference. Kenya is one of the founding members and decided to take up the initiative and organize an Internet Freedom Conference in Nairobi, which was very successful. There were about 450 plus participants from all around the world, mostly from East Africa, but also across Africa and other regions as well. It was the first time that internet freedom as such was put on the agenda of a major conference in Africa, which was really inspiring to see how much knowledge there's out there about the topic, but also how much capacity there still is to be built. Tunisia took up the baton and will organize a Freedom Online Coalition meeting in 2013 in Tunisia, and Estonia has confirmed that they will do that in 2014. So we have a few points on the horizon, and we're now looking to set up a steering committee of all kinds of stakeholders to make sure that we do get a lot of valuable input ahead of the 2013 meeting in Tunisia, which will probably be held in June. I could talk about this at length, but I'll stop it. Maybe we can talk about it a bit later if you have other people to take the floor right now, but I'll be happy to answer questions or go into the discussion.
So thanks, Joachim, and I think it's great in an IGF context to be getting more of a map of what governments are doing. I just wanted to ask Odas, who's from the Finnish Green Party, to perhaps talk about some of the initiatives and work he's been doing and his perspective on human rights in relation to the IGF. And then we'll move to civil society and private sector for their input as well.
Thank you so much. Let me start by first congratulating and thanking Sweden and the Netherlands for the leadership they have shown. Not surprisingly, Finland aligns itself on many of these issues with these countries, and we are very grateful for their work. Let me also start by saying that unlike the previous speakers, I don't really represent the government, I don't represent the executive side, I'm from the parliament, but it just so happens that the government and the parliament tend to agree on a number of issues, especially when it comes to human rights online. Finland sees human rights as an integral part of the IGF agenda, and we emphasize taking into account the perspective of vulnerable and marginalized groups when we talk about human rights at this type of events. And I've been happy to notice that many of the sessions during this week have addressed human rights explicitly. We have joined the Freedom Online Coalition, and when I go back home, I'm going to raise the question if we should also support the Digital Defenders Partnership, which I personally see is a very exciting new tool and initiative to help defend human rights on the internet. I thought I could try to touch upon briefly two issues that are quite different from the ones raised before. First of all, when we talk about human rights on the internet, we talk about issues such as privacy, we talk about access to the internet, we talk about freedom of expression, and no doubt these are key human rights issues. But also in democracies, the right to participate in decision making and influence decision making is one key human right. And in that regard, Finland has one initiative that might be of interest to this group of people gathered here. The Finnish Parliament Committee on the Future has launched a project on crowdsourcing for democracy. And the idea is to look at how the internet can help citizens engage with decision making, how we can get more people involved in policy making and discussions about future policy. We have released a report that was also translated into English. We have a couple of paper copies available here if you're interested, and it's of course also available for download. Oh, excellent. I have a marketing aid here by the table, and it's available for download, of course. We are also launching some pilot projects testing different crowdsourcing tools and approaches. So for instance, when Finland is preparing its first open government partnership program, that program is actually being drafted on the internet openly, involving all interested stakeholders and partners. The second thing we are trying to do during this year is to publish a draft law before the government has decided on the actual content of the law, and invite people to discuss that law proposal and suggest some changes. So if there are any people interested in this particular dimension of human rights on the internet involving engaging citizens in decision making, I would love to hear from your experiences and share ours. Now the second thing I wanted to touch upon is the role of human rights at the IGF and how it could be strengthened perhaps in the future. And I should probably state that this is actually my first IGF, so the ideas I present may be completely foolish and they may have been proposed a million times before, but regardless, some ideas. I think all of us heard that some organizations were banned from distributing material at the IGF. I mean, clearly, if we really believe in freedom of expression, that should apply to the IGF as well. So I think we need to make sure that at future sessions of the IGF, people are free to distribute whatever material they deem important and necessary, even if and perhaps especially when it is critical of governments. Secondly, I've had the opportunity to talk with some local human rights activists during this week, and what they say is that international attention is really important to their cause and sometimes literally vital. It can save lives. And I feel that the IGF could do more in integrating human rights activists and providing a safe haven for local human rights activists for raising their concerns about human rights online. We have had, of course, local human rights activists participate in discussions, but I think we could be more proactive in providing a platform to these courageous individuals. Now, one idea I got that may be completely unrealistic, taking into account the decision-making procedures of the IGF, is that should we not should be recognizing the important work human rights organizations and activists are doing more concretely, perhaps in the form of awarding a prize for organizations and individuals who are outstanding in their activities in defense of human rights on the internet. That could be one way of drawing the attention of the international community to the concerns, to the challenges many activists and organizations face. And finally, I think the IGF can of course do a number of things as a process, as a community to defend human rights, but I think we as individuals can also do a lot. I would like to underscore the fact that when all of us go back home, I think we have a special duty to remember that the human rights violations they do not stop after the IGF. They continue, unfortunately, in a number of countries, and I think we have a specific duty to speak out against these human rights violations when we go back home to our respective countries, when we go and continue with our work. We need to raise those issues in our countries and make sure that our countries, our communities stand up in defense of the people who are fighting for human rights online. Thank you.
Thank you, Oras, and those are some excellent suggestions and very interesting initiatives. I'd like to, and we do have someone taking notes, so we can capture some of these good ideas. I'd like to just sort of perhaps move to some civil society perspectives, particularly from global partners and also Nicholas and then Jeff. So if you want to move up now, you feel free. Sonia, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss some of the key issues that came up during Freedom House's discussions during this IGF. It seems like that many concerns were raised about the pretty dire state of internet freedom and the growing threats to internet freedom that have emerged over the last few years. Some of the things that were identified were the increasing threats to online users, as well as the increase of the number of laws, particularly over the last couple of years, that restrict internet freedom on many levels. As well, we've seen more and more journalists facing threats in their daily lives and sometimes even being killed. We've also seen an increase in the number of cyber attacks and other murkier methods that some governments seem to be using to stifle free expression online. So in terms of some of the things that came up as potential solutions, there were highlighted a number of issues in which different stakeholders really need to work together to combat this emerging problem. For example, the private sector is affected as well with emerging human rights concerns, particularly when it comes to the issues such as privacy and openness, because it directly affects their networks. One thing that many activists have highlighted is that having that support by the private sector has been the key component for them to be able to effectively lobby their governments for better policies domestically. One aspect that was particularly highlighted was the importance of working on these issues in the international settings in places like the Human Rights Council. The reason why this is so important is because these international institutions are actually places where international norms are being set. So having the Human Rights Council initiatives, such as the one that Johan described, is a very important step forward. However, one thing that was particularly highlighted is that many governments in principle agree with some of the things mentioned in the resolutions, but in practice, once they go back to their home countries, they do not necessarily respect or implement the key principles promised in these international meetings. Finally, I would like to say that, and I would like to stress the importance of free expression in international fora like the IGF. As a previous colleague has mentioned, instances where local human rights organizations and free expression organizations were not allowed to distribute their materials are of huge concern. This is particularly a concern in a forum like the IGF, where all stakeholders are supposed to be treated equally. So having a dynamic where one stakeholder, such as civil society, needs to get permission from another stakeholder, such as a government, in order to distribute materials is against the key principle of the IGF. I will stop here and hand over the microphone to my colleague, who is part of the Freedom House delegation and herself is also an activist in Latin America.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity of talking in this session about human rights. I'm a human rights lawyer from Argentina, I would like to highlight some of the topics that we discussed in the main session about openness, security, and privacy that I had the honor to participate in. And one of the most important issues that we were debating there was how to make human rights standards real in the practical world of the internet and in the world of the internet economy. And there was a lot of discussion about how to put into practice these standards and these principles that sometimes, for instance, for some companies, seem difficult to comply with. There was also a big discussion about the differences between the different human rights international systems and how they deal with issues like, for example, free expression and the differences, the different scope that these human rights international systems provide for human rights and freedom of expression protection, and how to harmonize and combine all these human rights standards towards full implementation of human rights in the online environment. There was also a big debate about one of the issues that I think is very relevant when dealing with freedom of expression online, and that has been addressed in the last Frank LaRue report that concerns hate speech and how to deal with hate speech in the online environment. What are the limitations that free speech allowed to hate speech, and what states can do to prevent these types of discourse without reducing the freedom of expression of all the citizens and persons that are expressing themselves in the net. So that was a very complex and sensitive issue that I think should be, we should continue to work on that to find solutions that balance freedom of expression with the other rights that are involved in this issue. Finally, there was also a big discussion that I think it was very interesting about how to create a responsible behavior from the parts of the companies and also from the users that are expressing online, and how to push for ethics in the behavior in the internet. This was much more related to the hate speech discussion, but can be applied to other issues on the internet. So this is a great opportunity for civil society to raise awareness and raise a voice in the issues that we are working in our countries. And I want to thank the organizers of this meeting for giving me the opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Just on a quick time check, I think we'll take two very brief inputs from the others who've been participating in workshops, Nicholas and then Jeff Brugman from 1810. I think we'll just open the floor and ask people to share their reflections and be thinking about what are the main points we might want to take back into the main session in terms of taking stock and moving forward. So Nicholas and then Jeff.
Very much, Joy. Nicolas Ssl, I'm a policy advisor at the Internet Society. I'll be very brief. Firstly, sharing some of the key outcomes from a workshop that APC and ISOC organize tomorrow, and then sharing some thoughts on how to take things forward based on the resolution that Johan talked about. So yesterday we had a workshop which was basically looking at the relationship between the open nature of the internet and how it is influenced. What's the relationship between the open internet and the ability to exercise human rights online? And I think one of the interesting aspects of that discussion is that whether it is conscious of it or not, the internet technical community is a key contributor for human rights. Joy actually raised the very interesting notion that the engineers who work to maintain the open internet can be in some way be considered as human rights defenders. So human rights are really in the DNA of the internet, and the DNA of the internet has been and is developed by these engineers through open, inclusive processes. These processes, and Vince mentioned it at the Google Big Tent event, happen at the Internet Engineering Task Force, and there is no sign-up sheet. Anybody can participate in the ITF, and it's an interesting approach because it's the very community which defines the realm of possibilities for the Internet, and therefore for the ability to exercise human rights on the internet. So this is a really bottom-up approach, this technical development of the internet, and in a way it demonstrates an interesting democratic trait. Another aspect, I mean, one of the background of the workshop yesterday is a study that APC and ISOC have been working on, and which is comparing the principles and the processes between human rights and key internet protocols. So that's that same spirit. And actually looking at the founding documents of internet protocols, which we call RFCs, requests for comments, it is quite striking to find that there are notions of responsibility, fairness, non-discrimination, and empowerment, which is interesting because it parallels with human rights values. And if you look at the way the internet was designed, it's decentralized, it's distributed, and its very design empowers the edges rather than the center. So whether or not internet pioneers had human rights in mind, and we should probably ask Vince about that, the notion of reducing communications barriers between individuals, notions of freedoms, were very important in building the internet. And you know, the first protocols were designed in the 1960s, 70s, and at that time there was a strong civil rights movement, so and freedom values. So that's something that's interesting to look at. So to conclude, how to take human rights forward at the IGF and outside of the IGF. Well, the Human Rights Council, the Internet Society has participated at the Human Rights Council's meeting for the past 2 years. We have offices in Geneva, so it's very handy. I had the opportunity to participate in the drafting sessions for the resolution that Johan mentioned. And I mean, I think this is a very, very important resolution. I think what we can do there is probably try to raise even more the awareness of member states about the multi-stakeholder nature of human rights. So maybe we could, organize a side panel at the next Human Rights Council. I think it's in March. That is something to consider. Regarding the IGF, I think that we should have an emphasis on best practices and existing jurisprudence. During my discussions with a few member states, there was a feeling that we have these high-level principles, the UDHR, the ICCPR, then there are national laws, and I had the feeling that some people felt there is a lack of something in between. So, I mean, when you talk about human rights online, the applicability of human rights to the internet is an important issue, and again, I think that the IGF is the space where we can exchange best practices. And last point. Watch, and of course the business community is very important. The GNI is a great initiative. So these are some thoughts to discuss.
Thanks, Nicholas. Finally, Jeff, and then we'll open the discussion.
Thank you very much, Joy, and it's very good to be here today. I'm actually going to start, that was a great segue to where I thought is the private sector. We are on the front lines of dealing with this applicability issue, and I thought I would start there and then maybe work up to principles. I think the IGF plays an extremely important role, first of all, in information sharing, and I would highlight some impressions from this year's meeting. First of all, this issue of how content is being addressed by governments and versus the freedom of expression, and how that is playing out in practice is extremely important to companies like AT&T, and the growing concern about imposing burdens and liabilities on intermediaries in terms of content is very concerning. We do not want to be in the position of being forced to police content or make discretionary decisions that are effectively stepping into the shoes of what a government is trying to do with content. So finding workable ways to address those concerns are very important to us. And I think the Frank LaRue report, which has been mentioned numerous times, one of the things that was so powerful to me about it was that it gives very practical guidance of the type of framework that allows you to think about if you're going to take action, these are the clear steps that how you do it. And I think building on that, the idea of best practices in terms of how we address these issues could be a very helpful way to address that. And it came up in the U.S. in the SOPA-PIPA debate, really the process concerns about how this was being implemented. Another big issue that continues to be a recurring theme, I think, this year is security and all of the issues around government access to data, government actions that are really driven by security interests. And again, I think we need to have a very clear structural and process protection so that private companies aren't in the position of, again, having to make discretionary decisions that involve our customers' privacy. So this is an area where we have been working as part of a coalition in the U.S. with groups like CDT and ACLU and Electronic Freedom Foundation to update the laws so that they more apply to the online world that we live in today. And those types of practical efforts, I think, are building a nice multi-stakeholder and informal working relationship that is very helpful. When we are going to the government together, it can be a very powerful coalition to represent these types of concerns.
Thanks, Jeff. I think we're just about back on time, actually. So I really just now wanted to open up for other people who've been participating in the IGF to reflect on their sense of the human rights issues that they've been hearing, particularly developing country perspectives, you know, those where both human rights and internet access issues are perhaps quite different from some of the others we've been hearing from. I'm not quite sure where the microphone has ended up. There was one here and there's one over here, by you, Fadla. Or people can just come up, people just might be easier. Please don't be intimidated by coming up here. Yeah, so please, Anya, yes.
Hi, I'm Anya Kovac from the Internet Democracy Project in Delhi. I had one comment and one question, I guess. The comment is that I think in this session, as in many of the sessions about human rights, there is still a very strong emphasis on individuals who live in repressed societies and in general the human rights record in authoritarian countries and how that plays out on the internet. I obviously think that is a really, really important issue. So I'm not arguing in any way that one should stop paying attention to it. But I do think that one of the greatest threats to the internet as a whole at the moment does not come from the policy that comes out of authoritarian societies, but that comes out of policy from democracies. And that's because the policy of democracies increasingly starts to affect what Nicholas called the DNA of the internet. So yesterday we had a session on criminal law in democracies and the threats it poses to the free and open internet, and there were examples, or there was discussion on how criminal law increasingly is written into the code layer, into the content layer of the internet, even how terms of service of big businesses affect behavior in ways that do not always uphold our human rights. So basically I want to call on governments that work in this area especially to not forget this issue and to remember that their activity should not just support the human rights of the people who are most threatened, but also work activities in countries where policies happen that can affect the internet as a whole and thus human rights. I think the discussion is on the table in other sessions, but it's not seen consistently as part of the human rights debate, and that worries me a little bit. And the second thing, the question was to the governments that are active in the Human Rights Council. I think Sanja also made the point that very often governments sign and then go back home and do things that are completely different. I do agree it's still useful that they've signed those declarations because it's partly up to us as civil society to hold our governments accountable and say you signed this and let's do something with it. But I was at one of the hate speech meetings that fed into Frank LaRue's report on hate speech in Senegal recently. And there a lot of the comments were on how governments are actually in large part responsible for hate speech. And so holding the government responsible within your country then becomes very difficult. And so the question that comes up again and again is, are there ways that we can hold governments more accountable within the Human Rights Council and within the UN as a whole? And so I'd be really grateful if Johan or Jochem could perhaps comment on how we can do that. I think one great initiative taken by APC was to look at the internet rights track record of governments in the UPR exercise, but even there in Senegal there were a lot of comments on how violations by governments aren't actually followed up in the UN. So there were a lot of questions about the value of the UPR process in that sense. So it's also a question to ask if there's ways in which we can support whatever you're trying to do there. But if you have any thoughts or comments on that, I'd love to hear them.
Thanks, Anya. I might just take a few other inputs and then maybe we can respond. Fadla, were you? Yes, but I think it's easier. The quality of the microphone is easier. And if others would like to speak, please don't wait. Please just come and sit here. And
Hi, Hi, good morning. I'm Fadla Adams. I'm with the South African Human Rights Commission. I'm a lawyer in the Parliamentary and International Affairs Program. This is our first attendance at the IGF, but thanks to APC, we've got a lot of capacity building that's been happening. So thank you, Joy. But just to mention, I've been noticing over the last few days that there's a lot of talk about civil society and IGF, and as was mentioned earlier, there's something missing in the middle. And coming from a national human rights institution, I notice that there is nothing being spoken about the powers or what can be done with NHRIs. I think we must not underestimate the role and power that they have in the greater UN system. Earlier this year, there was a draft resolution also passed that sort of amplifies the powers that NHRIs now have. Those that have high ranking and A status have the power to speak at the UN Human Rights Council. And I think it's important that somewhere in all the dialogues that have been going on, that there is a meeting ground where NHRIs are brought on board, because essentially they are the oversight bodies of human rights in a country. And they occupy a special space between government and civil society, and a special role at the UN as well. So I put that out also for future considerations. Secondly, this is to Johan from Sweden. I noticed that in the resolution as well, there's a absence of African states, as in Central Africa and Southern Africa. I don't know if that's reflective of the situation on the continent. I find it quite ironic, and this is my non-Human Rights Commission hat, that the Arab Belt all seem to have supported the resolution. And working for the SAHRC, we are the Secretariat of the Network for African National Human Rights Institutions, so we're fully aware of the dynamics and what happens in various states. So that's quite an irony, but I wanted to know what the reasons were for the lack of support from other African states. Senegal hasn't even made it onto the resolution, unless I'm sitting with an outdated one. And then finally, Anya mentioned about the UPR. I think although the UPR is still in its fledgling stage, there's a lot that needs to be done going ahead. We only had the second rounds of UPR that took place recently. But I think that it has an immense potential to make a difference in a country. Given that the treaty body systems is often cumbersome, states don't report. They report late, so by the time a committee reviews a state report, it's already outdated. And the UPR keeps things current. I know APC has done some amazing work with various countries around the world in pushing for internet rights and freedoms in the UPR process. And in fact, I think was it with Pakistan that there was a recommendation that came through. Whether or not states support that recommendation, the fact is that it's out there and it's been discussed in the Council. Earlier this year as well, Bahrain, and I was in Geneva when it happened, the President of the Human Rights Council, Madame Laura Dupuy-Lasserre, I think, actually made a statement and said that she is watching the government should they do anything against the NGO delegation and persons who had blogged and said things online. So that was quite a bold statement for her to have made on the international level. But nonetheless, it draws attention. So I think ultimately I just wanted to wrap it up and say the UPR mechanism, I think early days we still have a lot to see in that way, but NHRIs are a useful resource. And then taking the process forward, let's not forget about the role of NHRIs. May I also mention that the Human Rights Commission, South African Human Rights Commission, our chairperson has now been elected to head up the International Coordinating Committee of all national human rights institutions around the world. So this is a very good starting point also to engage NHRIs and have the conversation, because I'll be honest, for us we had no idea that internet rights are the same online and offline. It's just been a grey area, and I'm not sure if it's a Eurocentric versus an Afrocentric approach, and that whilst Europe is speaking about toilet, or rather internet rights, we're talking about water and sanitation and toilets in Africa. Really. In my country, 73% of the population that use the internet are in the two most urbanized cities in the country. So, but yeah, I'm just putting it out there, and again, the African states and why there was a disconnect. Thank you.
Thank you. Johan, would you like to perhaps respond, and then others?
No, yeah, I fully agree with that sort of observation. It was very important for us to get some of the key players on board, and Nigeria was very interested and very forthcoming in supporting this initiative. in previous years, in the work on the statement, South Africa was also on board supporting that. But I agree, we would have loved to see more African countries coming on board. I do think, however, there are some practical reasons for that. Many of the African states lack capacity to be present and active in UN in Geneva. They often have very small missions and don't really have the capacity to cover all of the things that are going on in Geneva. The Human Rights Council is not, as you know, not the only UN body working there. This is also one of the reasons why we're also trying to complement this work with the work in the General Assembly, where all states are present all the time to a much greater extent. And this fall we have arranged a side event. We're also working on several resolutions and also trying to set up a group of friends for this issue of internet freedom in the General Assembly. So we hope to reach out to African countries there more effectively. Senegal actually came on board as a co-sponsor of the text, very late, but they did. So we did reach out to them as well in Geneva.
Thanks. My colleague here, and then Henriette. So, yeah. Please just sit. You can stay there.
My name is Mahmoud Unad from Small Media, working on Iran. This was my first IGF, and I have to say that I'm really amazed and also grateful about the extent of human rights kind of conversation on a policy level. But one thing I think is we need to have more of a conversation is between the human rights, say the interest group, and on the technical side. It was the one session that yesterday that you shared was on the relation between human rights and ICANN, and I think we need to have more of this conversation with the technical side of the IGF. There's one, for instance, give you one importance of the there's a discussion, ongoing discussion within ICANN that in terms of the WHOIS database and the level of anonymity that it would offer there, or better that you can have proxy registration for domain name. I think more conversation needed in terms of the human rights and the basic infrastructure of the internet. Another issue is about the Ssl certificates, whether it is easy to get a Ssl certificate that it doesn't reveal your information, basically your level of privacy that would gives you, or the same with IPv6, and how you can have IP version 6, and how you would sort of give protection for DDoS attacks. I think this is sort of a more conversation on the human rights. It needs to go one level down and just also have a conversation with the technical side of or the technical interest groups of the IGF.
Excellent points, and thank you for bringing those points back from the other workshops. Henriette, do you want to just come to, or you want the microphone?
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming and for participating. Can you hear? Thanks everyone for participating and for sharing. I think the questions that occur to me is which I think all of you need to respond to is it enough? There's clearly an increasing mention of human rights in the IGF, and an increasing focus. It emerges through workshops, through tackling issues such as security and so on. But is it enough? Is there something that, especially for those of us who are on the MAG, the multi-stakeholder advisory group, what should we be doing to really consolidate this? And then the other question that occurs to me is also, at the moment we are increasingly bringing human rights actors and institutions and policymakers, parliamentarians, for example, who care about human rights, into the IGF. But I think, and including national human rights institutions, but are we taking the internet people into the human rights policy-making spaces? It seems to me still that the articulation between the internet policy universe and the human rights universe is still not dynamic and interactive enough. I think we need to work on that, and if we want the IGF to be influential, both in terms of human rights in internet policy and internet issues in human rights policy. We need to do a little bit more than we are doing now. And then I think my final question was also, I think we need to be cautious of this kind of, on the one hand, there's this assumption always that the internet is this open and human rights oriented, that it's in the DNA of the internet. And I do think we have people like Vince Cerf, the internet evangelist, talk about the internet as if it is this incredibly dynamic, open, free space. And I think while that is true and it's inspiring, I think it can also blind us to what's happening in the real world, which is that there are increasing restrictions. I think the IGF should both be a space where we evangelize about the potential of the internet, but also where we make people aware of all the risks.
Thanks, Henriette. Joachim, and anybody else can, if anyone else is wanting to speak, can they just clearly demonstrate that to me by waving their hand around so that I can see them clearly? Joachim, can someone get him a microphone, please? Jeff, there's a microphone here. Jeff, there's a microphone. Please pass the microphone. Yeah, thanks.
Such a cooperative effort. Okay. I just wanted to react to some of the stuff Henriette said, and also to Anja's earlier question about what can we do to follow up and be more concrete in specific countries. Hearing this conversation, indeed, saying there's a lot of human rights speak, there's a lot of attention for it, but how can we make sure it becomes more, let's say, that countries that are not following up what they plead internationally can be held more accountable. I think that's also very important to focus on the economic argument for an open and free internet. What we've noticed with the Freedom Online Coalition, for example, is that many countries are much more receptive if you stress that argument. An example is Vietnam. Vietnam introduced some legislation over the course of last year that would have really, really hampered the rights of internet users in a general sense, but would also have discouraged a lot of businesses from investing in Vietnam. And going to the Vietnamese government and saying, if you don't change this and this and this in this draft legislation, you're not only going to trample on human rights, but you will also really discourage a lot of investment and development in economic terms. And that actually led to quite tangible results in changing and tweaking down the draft legislation, which we thought was very encouraging. And I think that is applicable to a lot of different countries and regions as well. I believe that means there's a lot more potential for public-private partnerships of civil society organizations working with companies that have an interest in investing in countries, and that also realize that without firm, good legislation that allows them to develop, such as some of the basics that we have now in the Netherlands in net neutrality law that was passed last year. We're the second country in the world after Chile to have passed this. I think that there's a lot more work and a lot more to be done in this regard. It's just something that we've seen over the last, let's say, year and a half, and I think that we might want to focus more in our discussions on the potential for businesses as well, because that makes just governments a lot more receptive and will be a win-win in the end.
Thanks, Joachim. I'm going to attempt to sort of wrap up and draw out what I think seem to be some of the main points that have come through from discussion, and just reflect them back. I mean, I think that we've had a very clear message, for example, that if the IGF needs to model the principles and processes that it espouses, so that the IGF itself needs to be a free and open space where there is equality among stakeholders in terms of participation of civil society groups, a freedom to distribute materials that they think are relevant, not censoring civil society groups in particular. So that seemed to come through from a number. I think another strong theme was that there seemed to be a sort of a pervasive rights discourse throughout workshops, perhaps even in some surprising places. For example, in technical discussions about ICANN and technical discussion about protocols and on security issues. So that and also some suggestions that we've got new actors that we would like to see more of and deepen discussion with. So national institutions, parliamentarians, and other groups, and a desire also to focus not only our discourse on repressive or authoritarian regimes, but in particular to look at threats and human rights issues in democratic countries in particular, and understanding there are many different forms of democratic countries. And one thing also suggested was that we have more sharing of best practice for compliance with human rights norms in terms of internet public policy, sharing those best practices with each other. My own sort of thought is that I can sort of see emerging some suggestions also that the IGF might want to offer from its discussions inputs to other human rights processes, for example, into Human Rights Council processes, into national processes such as UPR in some way, and I think that needs to be explored, is how can the IGF discussion feed into other public policy spaces that are human rights focused. And it might be that one way to think in terms of the next IGF is about whether there should be some main theme, whether human rights should be a main theme of the IGF, with perhaps some feeder workshops on these topics. For example, some feeder workshops related to best practice, some feeder workshops where human rights institutions and other human rights actors, talk about internet freedom issues in their spaces. And where we're also able to give a specific focus to both domestic but also regional human rights issues near where the IGF itself was being hosted. So those were just some thoughts about our main takeaways. If you have any comment on that, please indicate. We would like to think about how we might reflect back this discussion into the main session later this morning. So any comments or other observations? Joachim?
Maybe just a big thanks for organizing this. For sure, yeah. And especially at the end, I think, of the meeting, just to sum up some of the discussion.
So the suggestion is, yes, to perhaps do this every year, to have some sort of plenary roundtable, there's some reflecting on human rights in the IGF. Thank you, Henriette. Good. Nigat?
Can you hear me? I just want to thank the Dutch government and Sweden government. Dutch government to give recommendation as a result of the UPR we submitted in United Nations Human Rights Council, and for Sweden government for the capacity building of human rights activists and civil society organizations in the developing countries like us to bring this issue before the government more, and to build the pressure on government. Thank you so much. And thanks to APC for organizing this and to, bring these voices from the ground. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nigat. I mean, the other point I would perhaps take away is there are, of course, national and regional IGF processes. So I think these are also points that perhaps we could usefully bring into this discussion in terms of having human rights roundtables in those, or encouraging human rights roundtables in those as well. All right, thank you, and thanks to Johan who will be reflecting back this session to the main group. Thank you.